The wool was a dark blue. Good wool, not cheap. His father had picked it out, insisted on it, said a boy ought to have one coat worth the name. I am in that room again now. The way I am in that room most nights, whether I choose to be or not, and I have the seam ripper in my hand, and I am working the first button loose, and the wool is pushing back the way good wool does, not giving way easily, as if the fabric itself has an opinion about what I am doing. I put 7 buttons in the dish that night. I know it was 7 because I counted them after. The way you count things when counting is the only honest act still available to you. That is where I am going to bring you, eventually, to the counting. But I need to tell you some other things first, or the counting won't mean what it means. My name is Bridget Callahan, Bridget Morin. That was before I married. And I am 82 years old, and I am sitting in this chair in my daughter Nora's house in Brooklyn, where I have been sitting for the past 3 years since my legs decided they were finished with stairs. And I am going to tell you what I did in the spring of 1869. Not what was done to me, and not what happened the way people say things happened when they mean they did them and cannot yet say so. What I did. Nora is downstairs. She does not know I have asked you here. She will know when she reads what you write down. And I have made my peace with that. Or I have made the closest thing to peace that this particular subject allows, which is not very close. I was born in 1,851 inches, a house on Sand Street in Brooklyn that had 4 rooms and 8 people in it, which by the standards of Sand Street in 1851 was not remarkable. My father was Patrick Moran, a dock laborer, a man of strong opinions and a stronger back, who could carry a 120-pound bale up a gangplank without breaking stride, and who read the newspaper every evening with the concentrated attention of a man who arrived late to literacy and is not going to waste a word of it. My mother was Ellen Moran, née Faraday, who kept that 4-room house with a precision that I understand now. At 82 was a form of argument, an argument against the assumption that people like us did not have standards, did not care how things were kept, did not notice the difference between a clean threshold and a dirty one. I noticed. She made sure I noticed. That is what she gave me, my mother. Not money, not connections, not the name of anyone who could help me when helping was what I needed. She gave me standards and the ability to maintain them, and I have maintained them in circumstances that would have broken the standards of people with considerably more to work with. I attended Street, Ann's Parish School, until I was 12, which was the full length of time the parish could be argued into providing. And then I went into domestic service in a household on Clinton Hill, where I learned, among other things, that there were women in the world who had time to read in the afternoons, and that this was not a feature of the natural order, but an outcome of having other women doing their work for them, and that I was one of the other women. I do not say this with particular bitterness. It was useful to know early. I married Joseph Callahan in 1869. No, I am going wrong. That is the second marriage. Let me start again. I married Thomas Slattery in 1867. I was 16 years old. Thomas was 23, a pressman at the printing house on Fulton Street, a man who was good in the particular way that some men are good, who have not been seriously tested yet generous, easy-natured, present. We had our first child Nora, in 1868. We had our second, Michael, in But I Am Going Forward When I Should Be Going Back. Thomas died in November of 1868, typhoid. It took him in 11 days, which was fast enough that I did not entirely believe it was happening until it was over and he was in the ground at Holy Cross Cemetery. And I was 21 years old with 2 children and a third one coming, in rooms on Hicks Street, for which I owed 6 weeks' rent, with Thomas's wages gone and his debts, which I had not known were as substantial as they were, arrived in envelopes through the letter slot with a regularity that felt, in those months, like its own form of cruelty. I will not give you a full account of the winter of 1868 into 1869, because I am 82 years old and I do not have the reserves for a full account of it, and I am not sure you need one. What you need to know is this. I had Nora, who was 8 months old. I had Michael, who was 2. I had a third child arriving in February, which was Daniel, who arrived in February as predicted, small and loud, and entirely unaware of the situation he had been born into. 3 children, $18 in debt to the landlord, $14 in debt to Thomas's brother in Flushing, who had been generous with the money and less generous with the time allowed to repay it. No income, no family in a position to take us in, and the awareness growing through February and March of 1869 with the slow, terrible clarity of a thing you keep trying not to see, that I could not keep all 3 of them. That is the ground. That is what I am asking you to stand on with me before I take you any further. I want to tell you about Mrs. Hannigan before I go further, because she matters, and she has not been given her due in the version of this story I have been carrying. Mrs. Hannigan was my neighbor on Hicks Street, a widow herself, 50-odd years old, who had come through things I did not know the full of, and who brought me soup twice a week through the winter, and who sat with me the night Daniel was born, and who said, this is the thing she said, which I have turned over so many times. I have worn the edges off it. She said, Bridget, there is no shame in knowing what you cannot do. She meant it kindly. I want to be clear about that. She was the kindest woman on that street, and possibly the kindest woman I have ever known. And she meant that sentence as a comfort, and I received it as a comfort in the moment she said it, and I have been arguing with it for 64 years. Because what I could not do in March of 1869 was keep 3 children alive on nothing. That is the accurate statement of the situation. And Mrs. Hannigan was telling me that knowing this was not a failure. What she did not say, what I do not think she had considered, was that knowing what you cannot do and then doing it anyway are 2 different things. And the gap between them is where I have been living ever since. There is a man I need to tell you about. A young man, as he was then. He would be in his 60s now, if he is still living, which I do not know. His name was Robert Vane. He was a clerk at the Children's Aid Society office on Mulberry Street in 1869, a man of perhaps 25, with the organized, slightly distant manner of someone who has learned to process large amounts of human difficulty without letting it accumulate. He was not unkind, he was efficient, which in the circumstances was the more useful quality. I am going to tell you about my first visit to that office and my second, and what Robert Vane told me at each of them, because it is important that you understand this was not a single impulsive act. It was not a moment of desperation, the way I have sometimes allowed people to believe. It was a decision made over several weeks, with information gathered, with alternatives examined and found insufficient, with a particular morning chosen and a particular set of preparations made. I want you to understand that I knew what I was doing. I want you to understand that I did it anyway. Robert Vane will come back into this accounting later. The story is not finished with him. But that is where I am going to stop for now, because I want you to sit with what I have told you for a moment before I take you to Mulberry Street. The buttons are in a dish on the windowsill behind me. 6 of them. I will tell you about the 6th, the missing one, when we get there. We will get there. I went to the Mulberry Street office for the first time on the 14th of February, 1869. I know it was the 14th because Daniel was 12 days old, and I had counted every one of those days. The way you count days when you are trying to measure whether you are getting stronger or the situation is getting worse, and the situation was winning by a considerable margin. I had left the 3 children with Mrs. Hannigan, Nora in her arms, Michael on the floor with a spoon and a pot to bang it against. Daniel in the bureau drawer I had padded with a folded blanket because I had not yet acquired a proper cradle and was not going to. I told Mrs. Hannigan I was going to look into a domestic position I had heard of. This was not true. I am recording the lie because the accounting requires it. The Children's Aid Society office on Mulberry Street was a plain building, 3 stories, with a painted sign above the door that I read 3 times before I went in, because I needed a moment, and the sign gave me something to do with my eyes. Inside there was a front room with wooden chairs along the wall and a counter, and behind the counter a young man with neat dark hair and ink-stained fingers, who looked up when I came in with the expression of someone who has seen every variety of the thing that brings people to that counter and has developed, as a result, a face that commits to nothing in advance. That was Robert Vane. I told him I was inquiring about the emigration plan. He told me, in a practiced way that suggested he had said it many times, that the society placed children between the ages of 2 and 14 with families in the West and Midwest, that the families were vetted by local agents, that the children were expected to receive food, clothing, schooling, and Christian upbringing in exchange for light work appropriate to their age, and that the placement was intended to be permanent. Permanent. He said it without emphasis, which is the most emphatic way to say a word. I asked him what happened to children whose parents were not dead. He did not flinch. He said the society accepted children from families unable to provide adequate care, that this was a recognized category, that I should understand the child would be listed as having been surrendered voluntarily, and that the society made no guarantees of contact between placed children and their families of origin. I said, "Do the families know where the children come from?" He said, "The families know what they need to know to provide a good home." I said, "Does the child know?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The child knows what is told to him." I thanked him and I left, and I walked back to Hicks Street, and I took Daniel from the bureau drawer, and I sat in the chair by the window, and I held him for a long time without moving, which I could not afford to do because Michael needed feeding, and the rent envelope was sitting on the table looking at me. But I did it anyway. That was the 14th of February. I did not go back for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, I tried everything I am going to tell you. I tried, because I will not have it said, I will not have it anywhere in the record that I did not try. I wrote to Thomas's brother in Flushing a letter of 8 pages that took me 2 days to compose, asking for more time and explaining the situation in full. He wrote back in 5 days. He was sorry for my trouble. He could not extend the debt. His own situation was difficult. I applied for a position as a daily domestic at 2 households on Clinton Hill, both of which I had connections to from my earlier service. The first told me they could not accommodate a woman with nursing requirements. The second offered me 3 days a week at a wage that, after what I would need to pay Mrs. Hannigan for minding the children, left me with less than I started with. I inquired about the Brooklyn Industrial School on Duffield Street, which took in children of destitute families for daycare and some education. They had a waiting list. They could take Nora, possibly, in 6 to 8 weeks. Not Michael, not Daniel. I looked at what I had. I looked at what I needed. I did the arithmetic. The arithmetic had one answer. I went back to Mulberry Street on the 7th of March. Robert Vane was at the counter again. He recognized me, I think, though he did not say so. I told him I wanted to make an inquiry about surrendering a child. He produced a form. I looked at the form. The form asked for the child's name, age, and physical description. It asked for the reason for surrender. It had a line for the parent's signature. I asked him, if I sign this form, is my name kept in connection with the child's record? He said, the society maintains records for its purposes. I said, can the information travel? Can someone later connect the child's record to my name? He looked at me for a moment. He said, Mrs., I had not given him my name. He said, the records are not public, but they exist. I folded the form and put it in my coat pocket, and I said I needed to think further, and I left. I am going to stop here and tell you what I did with the form, because it is the part of the story that I have been most careful never to tell. And careful is the word. I have been careful with it the way you are. Careful with a thing that would change how people see you if they knew you had done it. I did not fill out the form. I went home and I looked at the form for 2 days. And on the second day, I burned it in the stove. Not because I had decided against it, but because I had decided to do it differently, in a way that did not attach my name, in a way that made Daniel, on paper, a child without a mother. Not a surrendered child. A child who had simply appeared in the line, the way some children did, in coats that didn't fit, and with no one to claim them, which the society processed, because the society processed what came to it. I want you to understand what this means. I did not surrender Daniel through the official process, with my name on a form, with a record that connected him to me. I placed him in the line without a record. I made him an orphan on paper by simply not being visible. This is the thing I could not say. Not the act, the method, the deliberateness of the disappearance. The night of the 10th of March, I put the children to bed, and I got out Daniel's good coat, the one Thomas had chosen, the dark blue wool, the brass buttons, and I sat at the table with the lamp and the seam ripper, and I did what I told you at the beginning. I cut the buttons off, 7 buttons. I put them in the small blue dish that had been my mother's, the one that usually held pins, one for each button, which sounds like a simple accounting, and was also not. I replaced the buttons with plain ones from my sewing box, black, small, institutional looking, the kind of buttons that do not say, this child belongs to someone who chose these for him, the kind that say, This child belongs to no one in particular. When I was finished, I held the coat for a while. It still smelled of him, the particular warm smell of a child's clothing, milk, and sleep, and that indefinable thing that belongs only to that child. I folded it over the back of the chair, and I went to bed, and I did not sleep, and in the morning I dressed him in it. His name was Daniel Patrick Slattery. He was 4 weeks and 2 days old. He had Thomas's coloring, the light hair, the gray eyes that were going to be blue or were already blue. I could not settle the question in my mind, and I have never settled it since. He did not cry when I carried him out of the room. He was looking at the ceiling with the unfocused concentration of a very young infant, which is to say he was looking at everything and seeing, as best I could determine, nothing in particular. I am going to stop here. I am going to stop here because the next part is Mulberry Street and the line, and the moment the line moved forward, and I am not ready to go there in this sitting. I have been not ready for 64 years, and I understand that not ready is no longer a condition I can afford. But I need a moment. What I will tell you now, at the end of this chapter, is the name I am going to carry through the rest of what I have to say. His name was Daniel. He was mine for 33 days. I knew his smell and the particular way he startled in his sleep and the sound he made when he was hungry, which was not like any other sound I have heard before or since, a short ascending note, very specific, not quite a cry, more like a question. Daniel. I have not said that name out loud in this house in 3 years. Nora does not know she has a brother. She thinks she has 2 brothers, Michael, who is in the Merchant Marine and writes when he remembers to, and a brother who died in infancy in 1869, which is what I told her when she was old enough to ask. She is going to read this. I am sorry, Nora. That is not the right word, and I know it is not the right word, and I am using it anyway because it is the only one I have that is facing the right direction. The morning of the 11th of March, 1869, was a Tuesday. I know the day because I had chosen it deliberately. Tuesday was the day the Society's agents processed the largest group of children for the Western trains, which ran on Wednesdays. And I had established this on my second visit to Mulberry Street by asking Robert Vane what I told him was a general question about the program's schedule. He answered it as a general question. I filed it as operational information. I had been filing operational information for 3 weeks by that point. I was very organized. In March of 1869, I have noticed in the 64 years since that I become most organized when I am doing something I cannot look at directly. I dressed all 3 children as if it were an ordinary morning, which it was not, in ways I was not going to explain to an 8-month-old, a 2-year-old, and a 4-week-old. I fed them. I changed Daniel. I put him in the blue coat with the plain black buttons, and I put on my own coat, and I told Michael and Nora I would be back shortly, and I carried Daniel downstairs to Mrs. Hannigan, who was expecting me. I had told her I had an appointment regarding a domestic position and needed her to mind the older 2, and I put Nora and Michael in her care, and I said I would be back by midday. She held the door open for me. She looked at Daniel in my arms and then at my face, and she said, Bridget, just the one word. I said, I know. I walked to Mulberry Street. I want to tell you what that walk was, because I think it is the part of this that I have most consistently failed to be accurate about when I have turned it over in private. It was not anguish. I want to correct that assumption before it forms, because anguish is the comfortable version, the version in which I was destroyed by what I was doing, and therefore somewhat less responsible for it. It was not anguish. It was the particular state of a person who has made a decision and is now executing it, which requires a kind of compression and narrowing of the available field of thought to the immediate task. Because if you allow the field to widen, you cannot execute the task. I thought about the route. I thought about the time. I thought about whether Daniel was warm enough and adjusted his blanket twice. I thought about whether the plane buttons were visible or whether they looked at a distance indistinguishable from the original buttons. And they did, at a distance, which was the point. I thought about Thomas, briefly, on the stretch of Atlantic Avenue where we had walked together the first autumn we were married. And I told myself to stop thinking about Thomas. And I did. That is what the walk was. 23 minutes of compression. I counted those two. The staging area on Mulberry Street was, that Tuesday morning, a controlled kind of disorder. Perhaps 40 children of various ages gathered in a loose group near the society's door, agents moving among them with clipboards, and the practiced gestures of people managing a process rather than a congregation of human beings, which I do not say is a criticism. They were managing a process. And processes require a different kind of attention than individuals do. And it was that difference I was relying on. I stood at the edge of the group for several minutes. There were other adults nearby, some clearly parents or guardians, delivering children formally, with paperwork, with the society's agents noting names, some simply bystanders on a busy Manhattan street who had paused to observe the gathering the way people pause to observe anything unusual. I was not, from the outside, distinguishable from the latter group. Daniel was awake. He was looking at the street with the same unfocused concentration he brought to everything, the ceiling, my face, the window, as if the world were continuously presenting him with a question he had not yet assembled the apparatus to answer. I moved to the part of the group where the youngest children were gathered. There were 3 or 4 other infants and very young children, some in arms, some on their feet, holding the hands of slightly older children who had been pressed into the role of temporary guardian. I positioned myself among them. I waited. When the agent, a woman, not Robert Vane, a woman of about 40 in a gray coat, who was working her way along the group with a clipboard, when she reached the cluster of youngest children, she lifted her eyes to me briefly and said, "Name and age." I said, "Daniel, 4 weeks." She wrote it down. She did not ask my name. She was working through a list of 30-odd children, and I was one of perhaps 5 adults handing off young ones, and the machine was moving at the speed a machine moves when it has been designed for throughput rather than particularity. She wrote Daniel on her clipboard and moved on. That was all. That was the entire transaction. 30 seconds, perhaps, possibly less. I want to stop here and tell you something that I have never told anyone, and that I am telling you now, not because it exonerates me, it does not exonerate me, but because the accounting requires it. And I have been leaving it out for 64 years, and the omission is its own kind of dishonesty. When the agent wrote Daniel's name on the clipboard and moved on, I did not leave immediately. I stood in that group for another 20 minutes. I held Daniel until the agent came back through and began directing the youngest children inside the building. I let the movement of the group carry us toward the door, and then, when we were close enough that the direction was established, when it was clear which way Daniel was going, I stepped out of the line. He went in. I did not. I am telling you this because there are two versions of what happened on Mulberry Street, and I have allowed the shorter version to stand for 64 years because the shorter version is more bearable. The shorter version is that I placed him in the line and walked away. That is not what happened. What happened is that I carried him to the door. I held him for 20 minutes in a crowd of strangers while the machine organized itself around us, and then I stepped out of the line. I do not know which version is harder to be. I have not been able to determine in 64 years whether staying those 20 minutes was love or its opposite, whether I held him because I could not yet let go, or whether I held him because I wanted to be sure the thing was done before I left. And I am not going to arrive at an answer in this room this afternoon at 82. There is something else. When I stepped out of the line, Daniel was being carried by a girl of about 7 who had been assigned or had simply taken it upon herself to hold the youngest ones. A thin girl, dark-haired, serious-faced, carrying him with the practiced competence of an older child who has spent time in charge of younger ones. She had him against her shoulder, and he was not crying. He was doing the thing he did, looking at everything, at the ceiling of the doorway, at the street, not crying, just looking. He did not look at me when I stepped back. He had no reason to. He did not know there was a me to look for. That is the image I carry. Not the coat, not the buttons, not the street, that girl's dark head and Daniel's gray eyes directed somewhere above her shoulder, looking at the world with the composed attention of a child who expects the world to keep presenting itself to him, which it will, which it did, only not in any direction I could see from where I was standing. I walked home. I told Mrs. Hannigan I had not gotten the position. I took Michael and Nora upstairs. I made supper. I did not look at the blue dish with the buttons in it for 3 days, and on the 4th day, I moved it to the windowsill, where it has been ever since. Now I am going to tell you something about 1,869 that I have not told you yet, and this is the part that changes the shape of everything I have described. In the spring of 1,869, 6 weeks after the 11th of March, I received an offer of marriage from a man named Joseph Callahan. Joseph Callahan was the foreman at the dockyard where my father had worked before his back gave out. He was 34 years old, a widower with no children of his own, a man of steady income and steady character. He had known my family from the docks, had known me in the peripheral way of a neighborhood that is small enough for everyone to know everyone's general outline without knowing their particulars. He came to Hicks Street on a Sunday in late April, formally, with his hat in his hands, and asked me to marry him. I want you to hold the date in your mind. Late April, 1,869, 6 weeks after the 11th of March. I had been to see Robert Vane one more time before that Sunday. In early April, I do not have the exact date, I had gone back to Mulberry Street to ask, as carefully as I could frame the question, whether a child surrendered to the Society's care could be retrieved by a parent whose circumstances had changed. Robert Vane had said, in the same practiced way he said everything, the Society considers placements permanent. He said, children are placed in new homes and take new names. In most cases, he said, the families are not provided with information that would allow them to be traced. New names. I had not known about the names. I had not thought about the names. I went home from that visit and I sat with what Robert Vane had told me, and I understood that the thing I had done on the 11th of March had a dimension I had not fully apprehended when I did it. I had not just placed Daniel with a family in the West. I had placed him beyond finding, beyond reaching, not deliberately, but effectively, which amounts to the same thing in practice. And then, 6 weeks later, Joseph Callahan came to my door with his hat in his hands. I married him in June of 1869. I want to be precise, and I want to be fair. I married Joseph Callahan because he was a decent man who was offering Nora and Michael a stable life, and because the alternative was the arithmetic that had produced the 11th of March, and I was not going to produce another 11th of March if I had any means of preventing it. I did not marry him because I loved him. I want that in the record. I came to care for him. He was a good man to me and a good father to Nora and Michael, and to the 2 children we had together after a daughter, Catherine, in 1871, and a boy, James, in 1873. He died in 1912 at the age of 77, having never known, as far as I am certain, that there had been a 3rd child in those rooms on Hicks Street in the winter of 1869. I am certain in the way that you are certain about things you have worked hard to ensure. Here is what I did not tell Joseph Callahan on the Sunday in late April, when he came to Hicks Street with his hat in his hands. I did not tell him there had been a 3rd child. I told him I had 2 children, Nora, 8 months, and Michael, 2 years, and that their father had died in November, and that I was in some difficulty, but was a hard worker and kept a clean house, which was true. I did not say I had a 3rd child in February, and I put him on a train in March, and he has a new name now, and I cannot reach him. I told myself I would tell Joseph later, when we knew each other better, when the time was right. The time was never right. The time is still not right. Joseph is 11 years dead, and I am sitting in this chair at 82, and the time has never been right, which tells you something about the relationship between the right time and the things you owe people. What I owe Joseph Callahan, what I owe his memory is this. He did not know what he was forgiving when he came to that door. He thought he was marrying a widow with 2 children in difficulty. He was marrying a woman who had put a child on a train 6 weeks earlier and had not told him and was not going to tell him. He deserved to know. He did not get to know. I am saying it here because it is the only place I have left to say it. Robert Vane found me in 1891. I want to say that the way it happened, he found me, not the other way around, because the direction matters to me and has always mattered. I had not been looking. I had, by 1891, constructed a life in which looking was not something I allowed myself, in the same way that you do not allow yourself to stand at the edge of something high if you know what you will think about when you are standing there. I had Nora and Michael and Catherine and James and Joseph, who was still living then and well. And I had a house on DeGraw Street in Brooklyn that was clean and warm and sufficient, and I had maintained all of it by not looking. Robert Vane was 52 years old by then, no longer at the Mulberry Street office. He had moved to the Society's administrative offices on East 22nd Street sometime in the previous decade, working in the records department, which I will come back to. He had not sought me out for any reason I could have predicted. He had been going through early placement records as part of an effort to organize what the Society was by 1891, beginning to understand were imperfect and in some cases dangerously incomplete records. And he had found a notation. A notation. He told me he came to DeGraw Street on a Thursday afternoon in October, hat in hand, a tidy, silver-haired man with the same organized, slightly distant manner, only softened now by age into something closer to gravity. He told me he had found a notation in a file from March of 1869. A child, listed as Daniel, approximately 4 weeks old, received at the Mulberry Street staging area on the 11th of March. No surname recorded, no parent information, a note in the margin in handwriting he believed to be his own from 22 years before that said, "Woman in gray coat, did not complete surrender form." He had remembered me. He had remembered me for 22 years, not consciously, he said, not as a recollection he carried, but as one of those fragments that live below the surface of a working mind, and surface when the conditions are right. And the conditions had been right when he opened that particular box of files in October of 1891 and read his own handwriting from 1869. He had not been certain it was me. He had made inquiries. He was careful to say this, that he had made only general inquiries through the parish records and the neighborhood associations, the kind of inquiries that a records man would know how to make without causing alarm. And he had found that a Bridget Moran, later Slattery, later Callahan, had lived on Hicks Street in 1869 and currently lived on DeGraw Street. And he had come to ask whether she was the woman in the gray coat. I opened the door and I looked at him and I said, "You had better come in." What he told me took the better part of an hour. Joseph was at the dockyard. The younger children were at school. Nora was married by then and living in Flatbush. I made tea and I sat across from Robert Vane at the kitchen table on DeGraw Street, and I listened, and I did not interrupt, and I kept my hands flat on the table where I could see them, because I have found over the years that keeping my hands flat on a surface prevents them from doing what they want to do. When the body is receiving information it was not sure it could survive. Daniel had been placed with a family in Iowa, a farming family named Birch, outside a town called Harlan in Shelby County, who had taken 2 children from the society that year, Daniel and a girl of 6 named Frances. The Birch family had received Daniel in April of 1869, when he was approximately 6 weeks old. They had named him George Birch. I said it in my head several times while Robert Vane was still talking. George Birch, a name I had had no part in choosing, a name that was as foreign to me as any stranger's name, and was not a stranger's name. And I sat with the distance between those two things while Robert Vane continued. He had grown well, Robert Vane said. The Society's follow-up records from the Birch placement, which were more complete than many, the Birch family, having been cooperative with the Society's periodic inquiries, indicated a healthy boy, a good student, well regarded in the district. In 1889, at the age of 20, he had married a woman named Clara Pratt. They had a farm of their own now, adjacent to the Birch property, and they had 3 children. 3 children. I was a grandmother. I was sitting at a table in Brooklyn, and I was a grandmother to 3 children in Iowa, whose names I did not know, and who did not know I existed, and whose father did not know I existed. And I kept my hands flat on the table, and I said, "Does he know he was placed?" Robert Vane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Birches told him, yes. They told him when he was old enough to understand. They told him he had come from New York on the train, that his family had been unable to keep him. I said, did they tell him his mother was living? He said, they did not know whether his mother was living. I said, but he knows he was placed and not orphaned. He said, yes, I want to tell you what I did with that information, and I want to be as accurate about it as I have been about everything else, which means I have to tell you the thing I am least willing to tell. I did nothing. Robert Vane, to his credit, and I do give him credit, he was a decent man doing a thing he was not required to do and that his employer would not have sanctioned. Robert Vane told me that if I wished to make contact, he could not facilitate it officially, but he could tell me where to write, and that what I did with the address was my own affair. He wrote the address on a piece of paper, and he set it on the table between us, and he put on his hat, and he said he hoped he had done right by coming, and I said he had, and I showed him out. I looked at the address for the rest of that afternoon. Harlan, Iowa. George Birch, Rural Route 4. I could write a letter. I knew what a letter to that address would do. It would arrive in the hands of a 22-year-old man with a wife and 3 children and a farm and a name that was not the name I had given him, and it would tell him that the woman who had carried him to Mulberry Street on the 11th of March, 1869, was alive and living in Brooklyn and was, what? What was she? Sorry? Glad? Asking something? Offering something? What did I have to offer? I sat at that table until Joseph came home from the dockyard at 5:30, and when I heard his boots on the steps, I folded the paper and put it in my apron pocket, and I got up and I put supper on, and I did not tell him. I have taken out that paper many times in the 42 years since Robert Vane put it on my table. I have held it and looked at it and put it away. I took it out when Catherine married in 1893, and I thought, he does not know he has a sister who married a man from Queens today. I took it out when Joseph died in 1912, and I thought, there is no longer any reason not to write except all the same reasons. I took it out when Michael's son, my grandson, Thomas Michael, named for his grandfather, was born in 1915. And I thought, Daniel has children I have never seen, and I have a grandchild he has never heard of, and we are a family split across a fold in a piece of paper that I made on the 11th of March, 1869. I never wrote. I am telling you why now, because the why is the last thing in this accounting that I have not been straight about. I did not write because Daniel Slattery, George Birch. I cannot help it. They are both true, and neither is complete, because he does not know his mother is living. He knows he was placed. He does not know she is living and here, and has known where he is since 1891. And if I write to him, the thing he learns is not only that I exist. The thing he learns is that I have known where he is for 22 years and did not write. What do you do with that? What does a man of 42 do with the knowledge that his mother found him in 1891 and chose for 22 years not to speak? The answer I have arrived at, the answer I have been arriving at for 22 years, is that there is no good thing he can do with it. There is no version of that knowledge that does not cost him something he has not agreed to pay. And I have told myself that the not writing is therefore a form of protection, which I half believe, and the other half is that I am protecting myself from what his response would be, And both of those things are true, and I am recording both. The coat is gone. I want to tell you about the coat because I realize I have not told you what happened to it, and the coat matters. After the 11th of March, I had, in the rooms on Hicks Street, a small collection of things that had been Daniel's. The padded bureau drawer that had been his cradle, which I had returned to ordinary use within the week because I could not afford to keep a drawer out of a bureau on sentimental grounds. A cloth square I had used as a changing pad, and the blue dish with the buttons in it. There was no coat. I had put the coat on Daniel on the morning of the 11th, and the coat had gone with him. I had not thought, when I put it on him, about the fact that I was also giving away Thomas's choice. Thomas standing in the shop, running his thumb across the wool, saying, "A boy ought to have one coat worth the name." I had not thought about that because I could not afford to think about it, and I had my field narrowed to the task. I thought about it afterward, many times. The coat is in Iowa somewhere, or is long since past wearing, or became someone else's coat when Daniel grew out of it, which would have been quickly given that he was 4 weeks old when he wore it last. The coat is gone into the general disappearance of things that belonged to a life that was then reorganized. The buttons are here. 6 of them in the blue dish on the windowsill. I counted 7 the night I cut them. I am precise about this. I have been precise about this number for 64 years. And when I crossed the room the next morning to look at them before I dressed Daniel, there were 6. One had rolled in the night. I heard it, I think, in the small hours, a small sound, a button finding a gap in the floorboard, rolling toward the baseboard. And I had not gotten up to retrieve it because the sound was so small, and I was so tired, and the morning was coming regardless. When I looked for it the next day, on my hands and knees at the baseboard, it was gone. Through the gap, or under something, I could not move. Gone. I have moved twice since Hicks Street. The button has not come back. I did not expect it to come back, and it has not surprised me by not coming back, but I will tell you that the absence of the 7th button has mattered to me in a way I cannot entirely account for, except to say that an incomplete set is a different kind of object than a complete one, and I have known that difference every day for 64 years. Every time I have moved the dish to wash the windowsill and counted 6 and felt the place where 7 should be, the short confirmatory whistle, the one that means it is too late. I have heard that sound 100 times since 1869 on the elevated line, on the subway, at the yards, when I have had occasion to pass them, and every time I hear it, I am on Mulberry Street, in a gray coat, having stepped out of a line. The street is the street. The group is dispersing. The door has closed. That sound does not take me there dramatically. It does not unmake me. I hear it, and I go there for a moment, and then I come back, the way you go, somewhere in your sleep and return, without anyone noticing you were gone. I have been making that trip for 64 years. I made it this morning, sitting in this chair, when the elevated went past on 4th Avenue. I went there. I came back. I am still here, which is its own kind of accounting. Nora came upstairs an hour ago to ask if I wanted tea. I said yes, and she brought it, and she looked at the young man writing in the corner, and she looked at me, and I could see her assembling questions in the particular way she assembles questions. She has always done this, even as a very small child, gathering the pieces before she commits to the asking, making sure she has the full shape of the thing before she names it. She gets that from me. I have never told her she gets that from me because it seemed like a complicated gift to acknowledge. She said, "Mama, how long have you been talking?" I said, "A while." She looked at the pages on the table and she did not ask to read them, which is also characteristic. Nora has always understood that asking to see something and waiting to be given it are different actions with different weights. She took my cup and warmed it from the pot and went back downstairs. When she reads this, she will understand that she was in the room on the morning of the 11th of March, 1869, 8 months old, in Mrs. Hannigan's arms while I went to Mulberry Street. She will understand that she had a brother for 33 days before she was old enough to know it, and that she has had a brother in Iowa for 64 years without knowing that either. What she does with that, whether she writes to Harlan, Iowa, whether she tells her own children, whether she decides that the wound is mine to keep and not hers to open, that is Nora's decision. I am not leaving instructions. I am leaving information. There is a difference, and I have explained enough differences in this accounting without adding another one. I want to say something about the 11th of March that I have been working toward for 4 chapters and have not yet said plainly. I would do it again. I need to say that because I have heard in my own voice for the last several hours the shape of a story that sounds like regret accumulating toward renunciation. And that is not what this is. That is not accurate. The accurate statement is this. In March of 1869, I had 3 children and no money and no husband and no family in a position to help and no legal standing to demand anything from anyone, because in 1869, a widow in a tenement in Brooklyn had the legal standing of a problem, not a person. I had arithmetic with one answer. I got another child out of that arithmetic alive, and that child is in Iowa, and he has a wife named Clara and 3 children whose names I do not know, and a farm and a life that does not include me. He is alive. That is not nothing. I have known it was not nothing since 1891, and I have known it was also not sufficient, and I have lived in the space between those 2 knowings for 42 years, and I will die in that space, probably within the month if the doctor's careful numbers are to be trusted. And I am not going to stand at the edge of my own ending and tell you I would have done differently, because I would not. I would do it again. What I would do differently is write the letter in 1891. That is the only thing. Not the 11th of March, the October afternoon at the kitchen table on Degra Street with Robert Vane's handwriting in my apron pocket and supper going on the stove. I would get up from that stove. I would sit back down. I would write, "My name is Bridget Callahan. I was the woman in the gray coat." I did not write it. That is the cost. Not the 11th of March, which was the cost of 1,868, and the arithmetic of that winter, and the specific dimensions of what was possible for a woman of my class and situation in that year. The cost that was mine to choose and chose wrong is the October afternoon in 1891, when the information came to me and I put it in my pocket and made supper. 22 years I have had that paper. 42 now. He is 42 years old. He has lived his whole life without a word from me. And for 22 of those years, the reason was not that I did not know where he was. That is what I owe the record. That is the last thing. I am going to tell you about the buttons one more time, because it is where I started and it is where I have to end. 6 buttons in a blue dish on the windowsill of every room I have lived in since Hicks Street. I moved them to the rooms on Warren Street in 1872 when Joseph and I took a larger place. I moved them to DeGraw Street in 1879. I moved them here to Nora's house in 1930 when the stairs defeated me, packed in a cloth inside a tea tin so they would not rattle in transit and attract questions. 6 brass buttons, each the size of a penny, each with a small raised anchor design in the center that I noticed only after I had cut them off and had the time to look, which I have thought about many times since that Thomas chose buttons with anchors, which is the kind of detail a man who worked near the docks would choose, and which I did not notice until I had already separated them from the thing they were holding together. An anchor, 6 of them, in a blue dish. The 7th one is in a floorboard gap on Hicks Street, or it was carried off in someone's shoe, or it went with the house when the house was eventually cleared and rebuilt, as buildings in that neighborhood were. It is somewhere in Brooklyn. It does not know what it is part of. Nora will inherit the dish when I am gone. She will inherit it without knowing what it is, until she reads this, and then she will know, and the dish will be a different object in her hands than it was an hour ago in mine. I thought about sending the buttons to Iowa. I have thought about this several times in 42 years, a package with no letter, just the 6 buttons and possibly a 7th space that would tell him, if he was the kind of person who understood that an absence can be the most present thing in a room, it would tell him that someone had kept something and that the keeping was the message. I did not send them. I kept them. They are on the windowsill behind me. I do not know if keeping them was right. I know it is what I did, which is a different kind of knowing, and at 82 it is the only kind I have left. There is one more thing. I have written a letter. In the last 2 weeks, before my hands became too unreliable for the purpose, I wrote a letter to Harlan, Iowa, to the address Robert Vane gave me in 1891, which I acknowledge may no longer be the right address and may find no one who knows the name, but which is the only address I have. The letter says my name. It says the 11th of March, 1869. It says the coat was dark blue wool, and it says the buttons had anchors on them, and it says I kept 6 and lost 1, and have kept the 6 for 64 years on a windowsill in Brooklyn. It says he had gray eyes, and it says he was looking at the ceiling when I carried him into that doorway, and he did not know I was the thing to look for because he was 4 weeks old and the whole world was equally new. It says I am sorry, which is not the right word, and I am using it anyway because it is the only one I have that is facing the right direction. The letter is sealed. I have given it to the young man sitting in the corner with the pages, and I have asked him to post it when he leaves, and I am trusting him to do that because I have no other option, and because trust at the end of things is not a feeling. It is an action you perform with what remains. The elevated went past again just now, 4th Avenue. The short confirmatory whistle, the one that means it is too late. I went there, the street, the gray coat, the line moving forward, the door. I came back. The buttons are on the windowsill, 6 of them, where 7 should be. He is alive. In Iowa, under a name I did not choose, with a life I did not make. He is alive, and he does not know I am here. And by the time this letter arrives, I may not be here. And both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other, and I have no more words for the space between them. He is alive. That is where I am stopping.
In conclusion, the woman who spoke these words passed away in 1934, only a year after this recording was captured. She died in the same Brooklyn neighborhood where she was born, but her heart had been anchored in a field in Iowa since 1891, the year she discovered that the son she placed was alive, a grown man with a family of his own who never came looking for the mother he didn't know he had. She left behind a small dish on her windowsill containing 6 brass buttons, the missing 7th button serving as a silent testament to the night she severed her son's identity to save his life. While this recording and her precise Irish-inflected account are authentic, the visuals were created using AI to help illustrate the coal smoke and crowded streets of 1869 Manhattan. If this story of survival and its lifelong cost moved you, please subscribe and share your opinion in the comments. Was her act one of abandonment, or was it the ultimate act of a mother's love?